Hello and welcome. This is Mrs. Rowe, and today we will be talking about how water moves into and out of cells. We're in Chapter 3, Section 4 of our textbook, and primarily we're going to be looking and talking about the passive processes of osmosis and diffusion. There will be a second quick video about diffusion mountain, which is a quick, easy way to help remember how and why water and other solutes, water obviously being the solvent, and solutes move in and out across cells. We talked earlier about how cell transport is really important to all traits of life, for cells to function, for them to perform metabolism, for them to grow and develop. All of these things require cell transport, and especially water. Water balance is essential to our cells and how they function, as we can see down here in our poor plants as they're wilting and dying. So last week you did some lab observations and you put some cucumber or potato slices in water. And water over here is our hypotonic environment. So as we, let me get my pen going. So this one over here was our cells in water. Okay. And we saw what happened. Remember, the slices were crispy. They felt like they were going to snap. They had high, what we introduced the term turgor pressure as the water went into the cells. And you can see these particular cells under the microscope are pretty swollen. You can't even see the cell membrane because it's so tightly against the cell wall. And then we did a reversal where we put the cells or the slices in salt water, and they became very limp. They became very bendy. They lost turgor pressure. They wilted basically. And so over here, our hypertonic solution is where we had the salt. Okay. So today we want to talk about why. Why did this happen? Why does water move in or out of the cells? In plasmolysis, you can see this cell membrane pulled away from the cell wall, causing it to lose turgor pressure as water left the cell. So obviously these processes can go in both directions. And if we were to put these, if you've ever watered your wilted plants, if you haven't gone too far and they haven't died, they will rehydrate and plump back up again. So it is a reversible process for some of these. We're going to see as we go on that not everything's reversible. We also did our eggs in our diffusion lab, where we put egg in syrup and egg in water, and we're going to talk about that too. So to begin with, vocab. It always comes down to the vocab. And we introduced these words as we were doing our egg observations. We said that the syrup was hypertonic and that the water was hypotonic. And here's a new word we haven't used yet, isotonic. Before we talk a little bit about these, we're going to talk about solute, solvent, and solution. So these are some terms that there's kind of an assumption you know these, we're going forward, but if you don't, make sure you are familiar with these terms so that you don't get confused. You can pause this video at any point and write these terms in your notebook. These are also in your Quizlet review. So solute, when we are making a solution is a mixture made up of two parts, the solute and the solvent. The solute is the smaller part that is dissolved. In this case, it's a solid. It does not have to be a solid. It could be a liquid. It could be a gas. And then the solvent is usually the larger part that does the dissolving. My chemistry kids usually remember that solvent has more letters. It's the bigger word, it's the bigger part. Solute has less letters. It's the smaller word, it's the smaller part. But when you put the two together, they make up what we call a solution. And in a solution, all the parts are equally dispersed or spread out, and you can no longer see the parts when they are dissolved and spread out in our solution. So we are talking about solutions and how these solutions will affect our cells, as cells are always surrounded by watery environments in these solutions. So one of the things we saw with the egg is that when we first put the egg in syrup, which would be this one right here, this would be our syrup with the egg. What did we see happen? Well, we saw, this is only focusing on the water, so the red dots represent water. We saw that there was more water in the cell than there was outside. Water left the egg and the egg shrunk. And the syrup actually looked watery. If you did this and observed that, you could almost see a watery layer on the syrup, the water that came out of the egg. So hypertonic solutions make cells shrink. Right there. Hypertonic solutions make cells shrink. Big idea. Then we put our egg in water, and the water, there was more water concentration outside than inside our cell. So water flowed into the cell, and hypotonic solution, so there's our vocab again, hyper and hypo, makes cells expand as they absorb the water. So this one was obviously just the water. Now, if we were able, and I have done this lab in the past, what is what we call isotonic concentration, where the cell will stay the same. There is no gain or loss in mass or water, and that is called iso for equal. So as we look at some of these words, usually that would be, we know for our cells, what kind of saline do they give you in the hospital, like a 0.75% saline, that because it's an isotonic. They don't want your cells to shrink or gain mass. They want something that's going to be equal. So as we look at our words, this is where I would pause and get these words written down. Hyper, I've underlined, the prefix means is from Greek over. So you have more. I always try to remember sugar makes kids hyper. Yes, that's not true. That's been disproven. However, it's a common enough myth that we can kind of use it to remember that if it has more sugar, more salt, more solute in the solution, less water, then it's considered the hypertonic solution. And I wanted to point out that these terms are adjectives. They are describing, if we have a cell membrane, there are two different concentrations, what's called a concentration gradient. This is an adjective to describe, is the concentration have more or less solute in water than the other side. If the two concentrations, the two sides are equal, then we say isotonic, that they are both equal to each other. And we're going to discuss the concentration on either side of our membrane, inside the cell versus outside the cell, because as we've seen, it's going to affect what happens to our cell. Is our cell going to shrink? Is it going to expand? And what does that mean when we look at different life forms and how they deal with this? Hypotonic, hypo means under. If you're hypothyroid, your thyroid is not producing, it's not working at the level it should, so you're very slow and sleepy. If you're hyperthyroid, it's overactive versus underactive. Hypotonic means you have under, less solute, therefore more water. I always like to think of hypo like hippos in the water, more H2O, and then iso for equal. And so we know now, we're starting to learn hypertonic makes cells shrink, hypotonic makes cells swell. And we're going to talk about that some more later in our next video. So that's our vocab for today. It's really important that you get that vocab down. We're going to come back to this later once we look at how things move. But basically, this is the big idea. Hypertonic makes cells shrink. Hypotonic solutions make cells swell. Ideally, you want to be in equilibrium so that your cells aren't going to gain or lose. So an example of this would be a single-celled organism living in a pond, which is just water. A lot of these will sometimes have what are known as contractile vacuoles, because as all that water is flowing into their cells, they need to get rid of it so they don't explode. And so these contractile vacuoles act like our kidneys, and they keep pumping the water back out again to maintain that balance, all that water that's flowing in. Whereas oceans tend to be close to that isotonic level so that they don't need to be pumping out water so much. So, and so that's one example. There are many examples of why these concentrations matter and how they affect us, which we will talk about more. So tune in to part 2 of Diffusion Mountain, and we're going to get more into why things flow the way they do. Okay? If you have any questions, please let me know. And that's it for today on what is the vocab as we talk about how water moves into and out of cells in passive transport. Have a good day.